think preparing.
Yeah,
We are live. Here we go. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to welcome my friend. First of all, I should say who I am. I'm Menachem Creditor. This is my friend, Rabbi David Baum, and we are going to be talking Torah, and I'm really honored to have him as part of my book tour. I have a new book out called A Rabbi's Heart, which is essays I wrote between 2006 and 2017. All of those years are ones where David and my life intersected. And it's a big blessing to be with you today. Let me say a little bit about who you are in the world, which makes me really proud to be your colleague. The most important thing is you're an Abba.
Yes.
Your wife is somebody really special who does incredible professional healing work in the world. But Rabbi David Baum is the full-time rabbi of Congregation Shari Kodesh, where he's been since 2009. And to be the full-time rabbi of a community that started with such intention and to have created and fomented such health and diversity within the community, it's something I've watched you do from the very beginning, and I stand in awe of what you and your community have accomplished. David is Rabbi Baum is the immediate past president of Palm Beach County Board of Rabbis. He's the past president of the Southeast region of the Rabbinical Assembly. He's been on the board of directors of the Levis,
yeah.
Jewish Community Center of Boca Raton, and also serves as rabbi director on the board of directors for the UJA-Federation of South Palm Beach. He has done a million good things in the name of the Jewish people, including being in the Global Jewish Fellows, the Rabbinic Fellows Program of American Jewish World Service. We traveled to Guatemala doing good and learning about justice with colleagues. And he's an alumnus of the Clergy Leadership Incubator, which is an incredible program that supports and encourages rabbis in areas of innovative thinking, institutional transformation, and most of all, he's a sweet person who's giving of his time and sharing with me a moment of reconnection for us. So I wanted to welcome you, David, and thank you for being part of this conversation.
Great. It's awesome to be here. And let's go with first names. Is that okay?
Oh my God, I'm so happy with that. It's so much easier. I mean, you know, it's interesting because some of the people that I've had these conversations with are rabbis who are women. Mm-hmm. And the whole question of first name and how do we make sure that the respect and dignity due is afforded by the way we refer to each other. So totally happy. I'm so glad to be Menachem with you.
Yeah, the way I figured it is that, yes, we're rabbis, but rabbis are people too. And I thought that this could be, our conversation could be like the many conversations we've had. And, you know, we're not so formal, Rabbi Creditor. It's like I'm speaking to your father. That when I speak to your father, that's what I'll say. But with you, we'll go with first names. And rest assured, we are both rabbis, both ordained from JTS, Jewish Electoral Seminary. So yeah.
Yeah, no, we've got our bona fides. Did you? I know it wasn't part of our planned conversation, but did you always feel that way? That the title rabbi was obviously not unnecessary. I don't want to say it like that, but were you always comfortable being called David even after ordination?
So it's interesting when I look at it like going to a doctor. When I go to a doctor or dentist, who if they have to be a congregant or something, I call them by their title, and they said, no, Rabbi, call me, so by my first name. I said, when I'm in your office, you worked hard for that title, and I think that when we're in your place of work, that's what I want to call you by. Even though they insist, I said, when we're here and you're with patients and people work for you, that's what I want to do. And I think about that with a lot of titles. My wife is a clinical psychologist. She's a doctor. And oftentimes people call her Rebbitzin or call her by her first name. And for me, it's an important thing that she be called by her title when we're in certain settings. So I kind of go back and forth. I do go by Rabbi Baum, but I do let my guard down with friends and family, obviously. And at times with congregants when we're not in a formal setting, but I know that rabbis have different approaches. A teacher of both of ours, Rabbi Jack Moline, I remember, I think we were probably in an RTI class, which I'm going to get to in a minute, where I think I'm Rabbi Jack or I'm Jack. And that works for him. I do think that there needs to be a bit of formality. I think we live in a very informal culture, which is really great compared to the stuffiness of the past. At the same time, it's okay to have a little formality and to live by your titles.
Yeah,
So
I appreciate
that's
that.
my approach.
Yeah, I think about it sometimes. I remember there's a book, I don't know if you read it, called By the Power Vested in Me, the Rabbi's Symbolic Exemplar.
Yes.
By Jack Bloom. And the opening chapter, he talks about how he really wanted to learn with this one mentor of his. And the mentor agreed to teach him for free as long as he would never go by his first name.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first chapter is him mourning the loss of his first name.
Yeah.
I thought about that a lot. I think when I was first ordained, I was very reactive because of that chapter and because I'm the child of a rabbi, that I wanted to be Menachem no matter what. And then I realized this little pisher, Menachem, who was 26, by telling everyone not to call him rabbi, ended up not really being treated like a rabbi. And
Right.
there is something lost. So I appreciate a lot of the way that you just framed that.
It was interesting. I think he's on our rabbinic listserv, and I think he's passed away, right?
Yeah, he died a few years ago.
So he just called. I posted a question, and he called me randomly. And I was like on my way somewhere, who knows, funeral or something. I'm in the car, and he's like, "Yes, this is Rabbi Jack Bloom." And I said, "Who?" Yeah, the guy who wrote the Spiritual Exemplar book. He's like, "Yeah, it's me." I said, "Okay, what's?" I mean, we've never met. He's more in the reform world. I think that book is like required reading. It wasn't required when I was in rabbinical school. And it was just an interesting conversation. He talked about some personal things, and it was like he wasn't his title, I guess. He was like he said, "I'm a human being." So even he, in his felt like I got to let my guard down a little bit. So anyway, it was an interesting experience that I not thought of in many years. So. I wanted to, I don't know if you recall when we first met. I do. It was at RTI. And for those who are watching who don't know, RTI is called the Rabbinic Training Institute. And it's run through the Jewish Theological Seminary, where both Rabbi Creditor and I think your father also were ordained.
And my sister.
And your sister, who is serving in the military. Yonina is where now? Or Rabbi Yonina Creditor is where?
Lieutenant Rabbi Yonina Creditor.
Lieutenant, exactly. We should use the title, exactly.
Right. She's based in San Diego doing work with the Navy as a chaplain. She's really, her work blows me away.
I mean, all of them, it's really incredible. And I think I saw her on video do something for the RA convention, and just want to give her due, and all the clergy who are serving the military. So RTI is this, I didn't really know what it was. It was my first or second year in the rabbinate. And I had heard, you should go to this retreat, RTI. So I get there, and it was like rabbi camp. I mean, that's what they call it, rabbi camp. And I remember walking into the cafeteria, and it's kind of like you were walking, I don't think anyone from my class was there. And you walk in, and you're just like a kid again, back in the big cafeteria. Where do I sit? Who do I sit with? Who do I know? And you pulled up a chair, and with this first year rabbi who didn't know really anyone, and introduced herself. And then you said, this food, and by the way, it is great food, but Rabbi Creditor at the time, Menachem, you were in Berkeley, and there's not a lot of kosher meat places in Berkeley. So I don't think there's any, actually. So that's when you introduced me to the Chinese restaurant that's a little ways away in like Reisertown or wherever it was. And we bonded over wontons and egg rolls. So
now I remember it. I don't think I would have remembered it as well as you did. I do remember running away to go get some real food.
Right, exactly. Like, vegan stuff is good, but I have this all the time. I need some meat. And then I was like, oh, Berkeley rabbi eats meat. It was cool. So anyway, it was just wonderful to be welcomed. And I think that so one of my kind of philosophies of life in the rabbinate has been really influenced by, there's a writer named Adam Grant. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's an industrial organizational psychologist, and he wrote Option B with Sheryl from Facebook.
Sandberg.
Sheryl Sandberg, exactly.
Yeah.
And he wrote this book called Givers, Give and Take, and it's and there's this theory that he has about giving of your time, and that to be a giver in life really gets you ahead. It also hurts you, but it gets you ahead. And he says there's three types of people in the world: givers, takers, and matchers. Takers take things without ever giving back in response. There's very few of them, actually. Matchers is what most people are, which is quid pro quo. You give and I get back and whatever. And then there's givers. There's a very small group, just like the takers, who give as much as possible without wanting anything in return. And when I look at like inviting someone to your table when you don't really have to, I look at that as like just giving of, it's your time, it's your I'm trying to figure out the right word, but it's something that it's also about mentorship. And as I look at our relationship, I've learned so much from you over the years. And that was kind of the beginning of being, we're colleagues and friends, but you're also one of my teachers. And so I want to thank you for giving of yourself, not only to me, but to so many in the world. And that really does come through in your book, which I look forward to speaking about.
Thank you. I'm touched by that. It's something I'm sure you, first of all, I know that you embody it because I watch you in the world too. And I'm sure it's something that we each understand more deeply now than maybe we did when we were first ordained. When we give in the way that we give, right, there is a certain element of deep meaning that we gain, right? The act of giving with purity. I mean, tradition calls certain acts true love. Just yesterday I did a funeral where I was talking about the term in Hebrew, chesed shalamet, an act of true love, because when we take care of those who die, we know we're not going to be repaid. Right. It's truly love when we are only giving. But those actions are really singular. They're not very common. And, I brought you to the table and look what I gained. Mm-hmm. Right? I have felt this in so many different ways in my life, not just my rabbinate, that when I give from a place of welcoming and openness and curiosity, I am so much stronger and happier as a person. So even though I'm honored to be in that category in your heart, of giving, it's not a quid pro quo. I don't give so that I'll get, but when we give in that way, we get so much.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's just a more expansive way of thinking about what we gain back. So it could be just building relationships, and you're improving yourself by meeting more people and learning. Giving to the world. I think about that a lot with mentorship, and how as not just rabbis should do this, but everyone should do it. And he speaks about it in his book a lot, but about that's the ultimate source of giving, is to be a Rav, and to it's such a part of our tradition, raise up many students. And I think it's not just rabbis who can do this, but really everyone should be able to do this, should mentor other people. I think about a lot of you're talking about funerals, about we kind of briefly touched base yesterday. I love the funeral car conversations.
Isn't that funny? Like
the video driving, it's like carpool karaoke in the darkest way. But
but can you imagine non-rabbis how they might experience that? Where are you? How are you doing? Well, right. I'm driving through.
Right, exactly. I'm on my way to a funeral. I'll call you right back. But it's where was I going with this? I got off track.
Mentorship, and we were talking about
right?
that.
Yeah. I know when I think about eulogies that I've given, the most special ones are really he or she, was one of my teachers, and not just for kids, but of friends, and that he or she gave me a chance. I just think the world would be a lot better if we all looked at ourselves in that way of saying, let's raise up as many students as possible.
Amen. Yeah, I think that would be a glorious world. You know, you're saying you wish everyone would do it. I wish all rabbis would do it. You know, it's not baked into the DNA by profession, but I think some of us understand that life is better when we share it.
Yeah.
You know, I've always loved that teaching. I think it's in the Sim Shalom, the prayer book for weekdays, but not in the Shabbat one. The very beginning of each day, we're supposed to learn a little bit of Torah as part of prayer. It's this gorgeous teaching. And there's a chapter of Proverbs that some people sing to spouses Friday nights called Eshet Chayil. And the verse says in Hebrew, "Pia patcha b'chochma v'torat chesed al lashona." She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the Torah of chesed, of love, is on her tongue. So the rabbis immediately say, wait, there's a Torah that's about love? Does that mean that there's a Torah that's not about love? What's the difference? And their answer is, Torah that you learn not in order to share, that's not a Torah of love. A Torah that you learn in order to share, that's a Torah of chesed, of love.
Wow.
And so I think that's what you're saying about all of us. We should make sure that what we learn, what we gain, the wisdom that we accumulate, it's meant to be shared. Otherwise, what is it?
Right. Yeah. I collected comic books as a kid. I don't know if you did.
Yeah, sure.
My parents are finally, they're like, you're 40. You need to pick up your comic books. It's in the garage. So I got them. And it was funny because my kids, they want to read them. Like, this one's, I'm like a 12-year-old again. No, don't bend the page. This is, it's going to be worth something someday. Like, it's been 20 years. If it's not worth anything now, when's it going to be worth anything? And I thought about that. Like, when you collect comics, you put it in like this plastic thing, and you cover it, and it has to be perfect and not used. And that's just like the opposite of Torah. The Torah is this like scroll that's has to be opened all the time. You can't touch it, but you have to, be with it. And I think we made a decision in our congregation during the pandemic not to only open the Torah when we're together in person as a minyan, with a minyan. Mm-hmm. That was the one distinction that I made. And it's been really rough, I know, just not only for me, but for congregants to be away from the actual Torah scroll and everything that surrounds it. And we're coming back slowly, and back, we just read Torah last week in person. And so it's I do think about that, that Torah is meant to be shared. It's not meant to be put in a Mylar, thing and hoarded, but it is meant to be shared. So
I love that.
Yeah. I wanted to just also just looking at the book and different things that I noticed, and talk about some of the experiences you mentioned, that these are a collection of essays, sermons, and also I think some of them were just posts that came from the heart during the years of 2006, 2017, which I look at as these, like, I'm trying to think back to how formative and rough and also beautiful these years have been. We've gone through a lot together. And I wanted to talk about a couple of the things that I read, and specifically an experience that we had together, which was when we went to Washington, D.C. This was after the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary. And you had called me and said, I'm going to DC with an organization called PICO, a broad-based organizing group. And I want to bring rabbis with me, and I would love for you to come. I was really honored, and I was moved by the sheer horror of Sandy Hook. And I just said, when is enough? And that was the impetus to come and to lobby for just common sense gun reform. And I think it was originally, we're going to meet with the president, and then it was the vice president, which little did we know at the time was the Obama administration, that it would be Vice President Biden, who's now President Biden. And we talked about, how crazy, if you would have predicted how this would have happened, who would have known? But I was wondering if you could just speak about that trip a little bit, and I wanted to just pick your brain about what you learned from it, and also how you got to that point of even inviting us.
Yeah, I remember that trip really well. I remember sharing it with you. I remember specifically the essay that you wrote afterwards that was included in the first Rabbis Against Gun Violence book. How I got there was that I was a rabbi of a congregation in Berkeley, California. And the pastor across the street and I had developed a really nice friendship when I first got there. And he was one of the leaders in PICO, which is now actually called Faith in Action or Faith Matters. It's a really interesting organization, not a lot of Jews, which was true, especially in that day, because when he asked me to sign the letter that led to that trip, I said, sure. And then I looked at the letter, I'm like, I'm the only Jew here, and there's a lot of names. So I called him, his name is Michael McBride. So I said, Michael, why am I the only Jew? He said, you're the Jew I know. And I said, well, do you want more Jews? He said, you can get Jews? I said, yeah. So he invited me to be part of this faith leaders delegation to the White House in the month after, 2 months after Sandy Hook. So I reached out to some colleagues, proud of myself. I mean, that's how, how did I get involved in this? I'm a faith leader and I knew somebody who was connected and I wanted to do good. Had I paid attention to the issue? No, not really. Did I understand really what I was getting into? Not at all. I knew that this was important. I knew that gun violence is wrong, but I didn't know the details. And I saw that there was an absence of Jewish leaders. So I reached around the country, got different representatives of different parts of the Jewish world, including you. And we show up. And as soon as we get there, I just, you wrote about this eloquently. I just realized that I didn't know anything. Like who was I to show up as if I knew the answers to things? And that became most clear on the visible level, because as I looked around the room, there were 90 faith leaders there. 8 of us were rabbis. 90 of us there, 8 of us were rabbis. Who were the white people in the room? The rabbis. Maybe 1 or 2 facilitators were also not people of color. And all of a sudden I said, oh, I don't understand myself. I don't know this issue. I don't know where I am. And that became most clear. This was a focus of what you wrote, when the facilitator who broke us into groups after I brazenly presented something that I called a prophetic answer to gun violence. Now I look back and I don't disagree with what I said, but who the hell was I to present this as if I truly had experienced the ravages of this terrible epidemic that takes 90,000, every 3 years. It's like Sandy Hook every day, 3 times over. And I wasn't paying attention until it was young white children who were massacred. Right. So we're sitting around the tables, mixed up as a group. And the facilitator says, talk about a gun violence death that affected you the most. And around the room, all the rabbis were like, I don't have one. My father knew someone very dear to him who had already buried her son who died from gun violence. And then on the way back from the cemetery, visiting her son's grave, she was murdered by a gun.
I think she had she converted Judaism through him or something. Yeah. I will never forget that he shared that story, and I remember it to this day.
Yeah, she was very, very special to him.
Yeah.
In his books that he's published in the last little while, there are two chapters about her. Her name was Bonnie. And so the rabbis were like, I don't have one. But the pastors, and there were 2 imams there with us, so the religious leaders who were people of color said, you want me to choose one? And all of a sudden, I just I don't, who am I to speak? Right. So I was aware suddenly of my whiteness, of this bubble that I'd grown up in, and the recognition that gun violence is not, I'm never excluding any of these things, but gun violence is not typified by the assault rifle massacres that happen in schools, even though that's what galvanizes national attention, at least historically it had. And you're in Florida, not very far from Parkland. I think your
Right.
community was directly.
We did have, it was it's interesting that that answer changed a couple of years later. With the shooting at Parkland, we're about 8 miles from Parkland. And we had a student or two, some teens who were in the building at the time, just calling them on their cell phones. It was, and we have congregants who graduated from the school who live in that area in Parkland. We're in the part of the city, we kind of are on the border of Boca Raton and Parkland. They're very close to each other, and it's a small little kind of planned community, Parkland. And I went to the rally. There was a kind of impromptu vigil after maybe the next day, and it was in a field. It was actually one of my congregants lives like right, a 2-minute walk. I parked at his house. We went together, and I was really surprised with how many people were there. I mean, after that trip, I just became more aware of gun violence and activism. And there really wasn't much. There wasn't a reaction like this. People got up and spoke, and different politicians, and then you heard these kids. There was this chant, end gun violence now, and I'll never forget it. It wasn't thoughts and prayers, and that was kind of the beginning of the March for Our Lives movement. In many ways, there were no kids who really got up and spoke. It was these politicians, and there was an athlete, a guy who was a famous athlete at the time, baseball player, who went there. But then there was a moment where it was like it transitioned to the students who then took over. And that Shabbat was a really sad, emotional, powerful Shabbat. It was packed at our shul. And it changed everything. It really did. And when I think about back to that experience we had, and as you mentioned, just it was interesting because there were a couple of moments I just distinctly remember. There was a pastor. We were all meeting, and a pastor got a phone call, and it was a teenage girl in his congregation was shot in the face, and it was like it wasn't the first time he'd gotten that call, and it wouldn't be the last time. And that was when they shared with us how often they deal with in their communities with gun violence. And it was just an eye-opening experience, I think, for all of us. And I came in thinking about what I was there for and what I was trying to change. And it was kind of this reawakened pokeach ivrim of I was really blind to how gun violence affects disproportionately communities of color. And it was just, I'll never forget that trip. We didn't have the chance to meet Vice President Biden at the time. We met his staff, who I'm sure now are probably still there and are moved up in the world. But it really was an incredible experience. I'm forever grateful for being there with you and others. So yeah,
I'm really glad that not glad. It's the wrong word.
Yeah.
I'm really, really who I am because we shared that, and because of the invitation of Pastor McBride. Really all those things in sequence led to a different kind of awareness that we shared. And I'll just close with this one. I know you want to move on to a new direction, but I do want to say that when the Tree of Life massacre happened, right, the way the Jewish community responded to that is so important for us to be aware of. And given that we were thinking about it probably earlier as Jewish leaders than many other Jewish leaders, though not all, is a recognition that, right, the way that I've described it, the Tree of Life massacre was the worst and most violent attack on the Jewish community in America in American history. And it was the 12th gun violence massacre in an American house of worship in 3 years. Which means that our separateness from the issue, obviously, when we're in proximity to a school, God forbid, or to a shooting, right, that's when we become aware, but we are truly part of the American scene because we are so touched by it. Anti-Semitism is its own aspect of hate, an ancient version of it, which we dare not ignore, but gun violence is our issue. I became aware of gun violence as an issue when we were in DC. But I understood very quickly that if we don't pay attention to it as our issue, we're at the table, someone asks a question, we are ready to listen and be partners in solidarity.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time, God forbid, until
Right.
Tree of Life or Poe or.
Yeah. I mean, these things, it's it's about separate, being separated from something and then experiencing it. And yeah, I think that it was like, yes, that moment of it was twofold. It was anti-Semitism. It was also, a guy went in with the AR-15 and killed these massive people. And yeah, it was just think about these years. I mean, Sandy Hook to Tree of Life. These all happened when we're rabbis in congregations, and I think you were still in California at the time, right? Tree of Life, or were you already?
No, I was already here. I was here in New York.
Yeah. So I thought about this because Pesach Sheni was just this week, and I'm curious how you transitioned from California to New York. I mean, talk about literally the two different coasts of the country, but you transitioned also from being a congregational rabbi to now your new role in the Federation, in the UJA-Federation New York. I see a lot more of you in a sense of just the public teaching that you do on Facebook and on the internet and everything. I was curious how you've kind of made sense of this move and what you've learned from it.
Yeah, I appreciate that question so much. It was really hard. It was really hard. The coast to coast thing is its own very intense thing. I mean, I'm a New Yorker by birth, all of my childhood, with the exception of a few years in Connecticut. So going to Boston, I was an assistant rabbi in Sharon when I was first ordained. That felt far away.
Mm-hmm.
And then, when it was time to look for my own pulpit, the place that really called my soul was a congregation Nativot Shalom in Berkeley, California, where I served for 11 years. And it was magnificent most of the time, right? Pulpit rabbis don't only have an easy time.
Yes.
But when people would say to me, what's the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast now that you're in Berkeley? My answer was a little bit funny, but I've realized in retrospect it's really true. My experience on the East Coast, and it remains this way right now, is that there's a bedrock of tradition, both religiously, societally, politically. And if you're going to be an advocate for change, that's the burden of proof for you. You have to push for change because the basis is tradition. So they say, well, what about Berkeley? What about California? I said, well, let's be clear. I moved to Berkeley. I don't know anything about California, right? Berkeley is its own concentrated version of the opposite of what I just described. Berkeley was a place where I experienced everything as string theory. Literally, the basis of the ground under us was always shifting. Change was everything. And to be an advocate for tradition or stability of any kind that's the burden of proof. To try to push for tradition,
right? To
push for rootedness or even a distribution of power that was temporary, but let's have someone in authority.
Yeah.
The shul board or whomever. So
you were Tevye. I mean, you look more like Tevye now than you did in
I'll take that as a compliment. It's complicated.
Right.
At least he got exercise. He was carrying the milk.
Right. That's true.
I'm not pushing a cow.
That's true.
So the transition back to New York was interesting because
you grew up in, where'd you grow up in?
Long Island, mostly.
In Long Island, okay.
Yeah, my father was a pulpit rabbi in Massapequa and in Plainview, Long Island. And I did my undergrad at JTS in Columbia, my master's at JTS, and then rabbinical school at JTS.
Right.
So I
you're like New York.
That's it, right. And so coming back, on the one sense, was a homecoming, where a lot of the institutional world that I called home. I went to the Mid-Island Y camp at Henry Kaufman Campgrounds on Long Island. One of my first responsibilities as scholar in residence at UJA was to go to Henry Kaufman Campgrounds and dedicate a new little shelter for when it was raining for the kids at camp.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, oh, I know this place. Oh, these memories. Thank God no one here knows what I was like then.
Right.
So coming back to New York, first of all, was a re-entry into a world that had a sense of traditionalism.
Mm-hmm.
Unique as it is, diverse as it is, it's interesting to come home to that. It's also like I really became changed by my experience of Berkeley, where anything is possible, except what was.
Right.
Everything is possible. And I was shifting from a pulpit to a non-pulpit world. And I not only had been a pulpit rabbi for 16 years, I also am the child of a pulpit rabbi. And so I know that world. That world is home. What is this new thing that I'm supposed to be?
Mm.
And so even though it was refreshing for the first time to step outside of the framework that I knew, it was also very jarring.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know what success looked like. I mean, a dear friend of mine, the CEO here of UJA-Federation, when he was interviewing me, I said to him, his name is Eric Goldstein. I said, Eric, what does success look like? I have no idea what this job is.
I love that question, by the way.
Thank you.
What does I ask that all the what does success look like? I love it.
Right?
Yeah.
So his answer was such music to my ears. You'll love it too. He said, when you're too busy teaching Torah to meet with me, that's success.
Oh,
I mean, what a gorgeous answer from a communal leader to know that teaching Torah is what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most important thing I can do. But when I got here, I went through a deep period of grief.
Mm.
Because I have to tell you, you're in it now. And I know that when I was in the pulpit, especially in the moments that were hard, and I had quite a few moments that were difficult, I would have looked for something new to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm a rabbi. Let me do it differently. But when suddenly I'm not holding a community in that way, in these deep, thick relationships, where people, either in their joys or in their sorrows, they can turn to me because that's what a communal rabbi does.
Right.
Suddenly no one was looking to me for that.
Mm.
And I missed not only the people who I loved and knew and, thank God still know and still love, but I missed being with people in that thick way.
Mm.
And I've, as my role has grown, this is my third year in this position, I now have those kinds of relationships with many of the donors and students and staff that I work with, and I feel that I have a new pulpit, actually.
Mm.
But creating it almost, not out of nowhere. My predecessor, Rabbi Michael Paley, was glorious at doing this too. But creating it almost out of the ether is what it felt like. And then during this last year, with 9 o'clock broadcasts every weekday morning, building a digital community,
yeah.
I now feel like I have it again.
Mm-hmm.
But the transition was complicated. And I would say this to every colleague, every rabbinic colleague, when we change the framework in which we rabbify, which is my favorite word, there's an identity thing that happens to us.
Mm-hmm.
I understand myself in this one very specific way. And as they experience me, so too do I internalize that and see myself as that. Becoming a new version of ourselves is very beautiful,
mm-hmm.
but growth is always, Rashi says this, kol hatchalot kashot. All beginnings are hard. This is a glorious thing I get to do, and I'm in love with it, but it was very hard to start.
Yeah. Yeah. And you feel it sounds like you're really coming into your own in this position, that you're owning it.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, the job description basically has me teaching learning groups based on their field of industry. So there's a real estate learning group that comes together. There's a entertainment media group. It's fascinating. Young leaders, some significant donors, but more and more, this job is an active relational Torah. Mm-hmm. So I would actually say that the job was always something I could do, like the description was clear enough that I could fulfill it. But really the gift of this is I came into myself mm-hmm. as the job stayed still. I got to grow, and then it began growing with me.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a quote by Thomas Jefferson about this. It's on the Jefferson Memorial in DC. I'll butcher it, but it's something like, to expect the law not to change is to expect a full-grown man to wear the jacket he wore as a child.
Mm.
And there's a way that this garb, this in Hebrew, the levush, that is the rabbiing we do, it does grow with us. And it takes some time for us to feel ourselves in it. No more imposter syndrome, no more I'm pretending, but actually this is who I am, and it's flexing with me.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of beauty to that, and also what you're engaging in is like growth for adults. I often, when if someone comes to me and says, wow, you've changed a lot since you were a teen or in your 20s, I'm like, I sure hope I have. You know, like they look at it as a negative way, maybe, you know. I said, I sure hope I have changed. We're constantly changing, and when we stop that, I think that's when we get into trouble, is when we get kind of stuck in our ways. I took a class with Ari Ben David, who's a teacher at Pardes, or was at Pardes. Now he's at AIPAC. He started his own institute in Israel, and one of the things he taught us was he's really into Rav Kook, and he was saying about how do we know when we're doing the right thing? He says when you're scared, you know, when you feel fear about making this change, that's when you should push for it. And it is interesting. I think that we have to, no matter if we're going to a new position or if we're in a place for a long time, you got to keep on innovating and get a little scared. Speaking of that, let's talk about Israel.
Speaking of fear and growing.
Right. What I thought was interesting, what you said, and through your writing, there was one thing about you is that you share how you feel, and you take stances, and some of them are unpopular. I imagine that you were talking about the two coasts, that talking about, I remember you saying that, you know, I had to fight to put up an Israeli flag in my congregation in Israel. There, although maybe people hear, oh yeah, the left-wing Menachem Creditor, probably there you were like the right-wing Israel nut. And I was wondering if you could just speak to that about how, you know, going from Sharon, Massachusetts, I think you went from Sharon to Berkeley, and, you know, Sharon's a more traditional place. East Coast, very similar to New York in that way. And especially at that time, what was it like to go to Berkeley, that kind of moment when you dealing with Israel, you said, I'm not in Kansas anymore?
Yeah, that was the moment. I mean, the flag represented so much. And you're right. When I was in Boston, I was like that crazy liberal, whatever. I go to Berkeley, I'm the neocon.
Right.
Right. And I'll tell you, the story gives exactly the texture to it. So I was like, I knew Zionism was going to be very complicated, no matter what kind, when I got to Berkeley. And it was the first time I'd gone to a shul where there wasn't an Israeli flag. So comes Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, and I say to myself, well, we take out our religious symbols on all of our holidays. There was a flag literally in the closet. So I took the Israeli flag out of the closet in Berkeley, and I put it down in the lobby. And I thought I'd leave it there for the day, wait for people to respond, say how they were doing, say what they thought. And the enormous gratitude that people had that it was there was so moving. And so I left it. I left it. And I knew I'd hear about it eventually. So 2 months later, at the board meeting, some board members who were, you know, it was a good question, but they posed it in the most clever of political ways. Rabbi, you know, we've noticed that the Israeli flag is out in the lobby. Do you know how it got there? And I said, well, yes, actually. It was Yom HaAtzmaut, I put it out there, and the response was so positive, I thought it would be wonderful to leave it there. It made people very proud. And they said, what did they say? They said, oh, well, you know, it's actually illegal in the United States to have a flag of a sovereign state flying without the American flag. I said, oh, well, let's take the American flag out and put it out too. And around the table they went, oh,
yeah.
because it wasn't only Zionism, it was nationalism of any kind. The belief that a state could represent a noble idea. There was such a mistrust of power. And, not everyone anywhere is the same. Berkeley is not one kind of person, and all of us get painted inappropriately. So I would never do that, except to say that my experience in the shul was very revealing. And loving Israel was something that took a lot of effort. There were members of the community that could not imagine. I brought Anat Hoffman, who's the leader of Women of the Wall. I co-created something called Rabbis for Women of the Wall. It ended up being a movement for a little while. She came and spoke, and one of the co-sponsors of the talk that she was going to give wondered why I was bringing the Israeli flag out. And I said, do you know what she represents? She represents justice in Israel, fighting as an Israeli for an even better version of our homeland.
Right.
That's a dream. Od lo avda. We haven't lost our hope. Like, fight for the dream.
Yeah.
The idea that a place could be good, and saying this as an American today, and we have this very big problem in America that we don't know how to see the worthy dreams of people who vote differently.
Right.
I mean, we could point in specific ways, but let's be as open and loving about it as possible. The flag doesn't belong to one voting pattern.
Right.
And the flag is not a perfect story and never was. No flag ever is.
Yeah.
So can we fight for the dream that the flag represents, knowing that even the people who fight against us see beauty ahead and want it?
Yeah. I think that is a beautiful way of looking at it. It's interesting. My family is my parents are immigrants to this country. My father signed up for Vietnam, enlisted for Vietnam when he was 18 or 19, served in the Air Force, and but also, not politically right wing, and putting up that flag. And I know it's been kind of a controversial issue in our country. This, by the way, we had flag burning in the 60s. I mean, this is a constant thing about how we deal with our flags and what they represent, how we connect to them. But I think it is important to kind of redefine how we look at patriotism, and not as everything is perfect, but we honor, that if you say, just like, if I'm the same as I was back then, you're crazy. This country is ever evolving. I know that there are some people who don't like that, but if you look at the Constitution, I mean, a Black person was 3/5 of a person. So we evolve, we change, and I think that we have to look at the flags of our peoples in that way. So I think it's a really beautiful thing. Speaking about Israel, it's just looking at the book again. There were you look at the different titles, and it's you could see clearly you wrote this while at Berkeley. Ferguson is not Gaza. Ferguson in Israel. So what's I think what you were talking about, maybe you could speak to about why what drove you to write this, to publish it. I think this was, if I'm not mistaken, this was on your blog at the time. And I remember reading these things. The cool thing about this book, which I really enjoy, is that I'd have to go through your blog and your postings and everything to find all these things. I read some of these in real time. I read a lot of your work, and what I find interesting is you published it. You didn't change it. This is how I felt at the time, and I think that's important. That's why I just think this book is just great to get to know you. You've published so many books with other people's writings, and I think this is really the first substantial one of your writings. But I digress, because I wanted to return to this, Ferguson's not Gaza. What led you to write this, and why'd you write it?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. It's it's a longer answer than what we'll have time for, but I'll point. When I was in Berkeley, the BDS movement, the anti-Israel movement, known as BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, really has its heart in the Berkeley area.
Mhm.
And it's a very anti-Israel movement. It's not how to be a better homeland, a two-state solution. It is, I came back from an AIPAC mission that I was helping lead in 2014, scarred and traumatized by a bomb from Gaza that went off over my head, literally over my head, and Iron Dome knocked it out. I mean, and I came back shattered to a community that didn't understand that Israel was under attack or vulnerable at all. Israel has to always be wrong. So when I was on a radio show on NPR with Michael Krasny, as the pro-Israel side, whatever that means,
Right.
there was a pro-Palestinian side, as if being a Zionist can't be someone who believes in Palestinian dignity.
Right.
Right. I mean,
these labels, yeah.
It's so unfair. So when I was on this thing, Krasny asked the other participant, other panelist, when will the missiles stop? Missiles from Gaza. And he said, when the occupation stops. And Krasny said, but in 2005, Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza. And the guy said, when the occupation of 1948 stops.
Yeah. Right. From the river.
So one of the most important starting points is to recognize that no two oppressed peoples have the same story. The Jewish story is not the same as the African American experience. The African American experience is not the same as the Palestinian experience. None of us can completely align. And the danger of the word intersectionality is that it conflates our experiences as if they're the same. I am not saying as a Zionist that the Palestinians haven't suffered, but I am saying that Black people who were dragged and forced into American slavery are not the same as Palestinians who have, first of all, rejected the possibility of their own dignity time and time again. And for the moments where Israel makes mistakes when it comes to its treatment of Palestinians, which also happens, it's not the same. But when Ferguson erupted in violence, many people who were part of the Black Lives Matter movement, which, by the way, I mean, I'm in. I'm in.
Right.
We had a die-in right in front of my synagogue, and between the church and the synagogue. It was the only peaceful part of the Black Lives Matter marches in Berkeley. That there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of controversy. We organized this with police support. Right, I'm in.
Right.
That should open anyone's eyes to the fight for justice and dignity that I believe in when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians. But for some people, it's just the same. And that is a denial of the uniqueness of both people's experiences, which is injustice to the Black experience in America. That is injustice to the Palestinian experience in that part of the world.
Right. And
the conflation of the two also eliminates me from being able to stand in solidarity with both.
Yeah. I wanted to read you your own words, if that's okay. This is on page 122, 123 of the book, A Rabbi's Heart Selected Writings. This was the Ferguson is Not Gaza. Justice demands that we hear the cries of the blood of our sisters and brothers that has saturated earth and pavement near and far. To hear their cries is to be called to respond, and our broken hearts have known enough pain to realize that the paths forward demand careful thinking, brave action, and moral sensibility. Every human being is created in the image of God, but no two peoples or people's stories are the same, and therefore no two situations are the same. Our unique identities and narratives contain the basis of our own much-needed redemption songs. I love that line. Jews cannot claim to know the plight of African Americans, despite the weddedness of our own liberation story from Egypt. We stand together, but we know that our interwoven lives require recognition of independent dignity. So too must Palestinians claim their own way forward, perhaps gleaning from the moment in Ferguson alternatives to violence. Mike Brown's martyrdom was not the result of an act of conscious terrorism, and Ferguson's liberation from racism is not Gaza's road to peace. I thought that was really a powerful statement that I'm sure was very controversial when you published it and when you wrote it being where you were. And then maybe it would be completely differently controversial if you were in another part of the country, because you acknowledge both things and both sides, and talking about the pain of it, and I just and even our own misguidedness of how we understand different people's plights and everything. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot more, but I know we don't have a lot of time, so I just think I want to thank you for those words. I wanted to there was one more thing I wanted to ask you about. I know we're coming up to the end of the time, and there was a thing you wrote, kind of a sermon. I think it was a sermon, and it was about kedusha. It was about holiness, and it was a very, for conservative rabbis, Jews who are like part of the movement, the driving to shul on Shabbat is like this big thing. The driving tshuva, I don't know how many times at JTS we had these like discussions of, it ruined Judaism and all this stuff and everything. Meanwhile, very few people in our congregations talk about it really, but for us, it's a big thing. And you wrote about driving to shul and holiness, just that idea. And I think it really does speak to, I'm trying to find what page it's on. I have it written down because I wanted to just touch upon it. But what I found was really interesting is that you're speaking about how we kind of create and move into sacred spaces and getting to them. And the idea of, very much like the driving tshuva, you're saying, I just can't be alone on Shabbat. I need to be with others. Here it is. It's on page 207. And you go through even, why it's not allowed driving on Shabbat, because you ignite a flame, so on and so forth. And you speak of the difference between whole, which is kind of the regular time, and kedusha, holiness, and being about separation, being separate. And this is how you ended. You said, this might be a difficult topic for those who do not drive to shul on Shabbat, but it's also a crucial one. How can we look at holy people gathered together to celebrate or comfort or learn and see anything other than a place where nikdashti, where the gift of God's presence is made even more intense? And you ended with, as a question, how can we? I'm curious, as we pandemic Judaism, I think there will be many books that are written about during this time. There was another big change, which is in our movement, which was having services Zoom on Shabbat or live stream on Shabbat. There were a number of congregations that were already doing it. Nothing new, but kind of wholesale, many congregations, including my own, ours, that we started Zooming on Shabbat, something I never thought that we would ever do. I was wondering if you could speak to how you've seen it, not being in a congregation now, but in your new role, kind of stepping out of that you didn't have to make that decision. What do you see any parallels between this article and what we've been going through? Yes,
and I think you asked the question so well. I remember writing that. There was a survivor named Sam Nathanson, who I love so much. He died just last year. He came back into my life. I ended up doing the wedding for his granddaughter.
Was this the you quoted a guy said, "Don't call me a tzaddik, Rabbi"?
Yes.
Is that him? Okay.
Yes, because I gave this Dvar Torah when I was the assistant rabbi in Sharon. Oh. And I said, driving to shul on Shabbos, the key that goes into the ignition should be just like the talis you put on, which they're both vehicles of connection to God and to community. Right. And he said, Rabbi, I drive to shul. Don't call me such a tzaddik. Don't tell me I'm such a righteous person. And I said, Sam, you come to shul every Shabbos. You teach Torah. You read Torah. You're a survivor. You're a mensch. Mm-hmm. Of course you're a tzaddik. But a real tzaddik, a righteous person, never says, I'm a tzaddik. Yeah. So I think it's the same in this way. And you're right. I never would have imagined when I did this last Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. I put on my kittel and I sat in this seat and looked at that camera and led Kol Nidre. And I was a Shaliach Tzibor. I was a visiting cantor for a shul with Rabbi Jesse Olitsky and Rabbi Rachel Marder in New Jersey. And like, That's my Yom Kippur, looking into a screen, making sure the microphone's working. What is this? Where is my Yom Kippur? And the answer is, we have always, as Jewish people, adapted to our reality and never given up on each other.
Mm.
Technology is another way of saying a book, because so much of rabbinic literature is about how to lead a community when there is no book, because there were no books. Only a few people knew the words. This new technology that we call a book, or a microphone that allows people to hear. Technology can be used to destroy. I mean, Albert Einstein is the best example of that. Theories of relativity changed the world for the better and gave the world an atomic bomb.
Yeah.
You can use fire to burn or to heal. You can use a car, God forbid, to hurt or to go to shul. And the rabbis in the conservative movement who passed the driving tshuva, it was not called that. It
Right.
was the campaign for the enhancement of Sabbath observance.
Yeah.
Because they said, visit someone who is sick on Shabbos. That's a mitzvah. Drive if you have to. Call. Do what you need. So I respect the careful thinking of halachically minded Jews who, Rabbi Josh Heller, our colleague, did so much work with Zoom to make sure that we could use it in a way that was compatible with Shabbat observance. Our people were in need of each other and of us and of our faith and of our Torah. And this is how we're desperately trying. This is how we conquered the isolation.
Mm.
We found each other. A little bit later, I'm making this book tour with a few different friends. Karen Ehrlichman, I'm going to speak with very soon, is a dear friend. She's a spiritual director, and I was in a small group with her, just of great colleagues who were reaching out to each other during these moments. And at a moment, I was so sad. And I felt so alone. And she said, Menachem, I want you to reach your hands to me. Just close your eyes for a second and reach. And we don't say I swear, but I'm close to it.
Yeah.
I felt her hold my hand.
Mm.
And what we have created in this moment is not a compromise.
Mm.
Is it the same as me being able to hug my friend David? No, I miss you so much. I can't wait till we can hug. I need to be in shul with my people. I want the sounds of the creaks of our seats and the unrolling of the Torah again in your community and all of that. But Zoom is holy. It is a tool for connecting to each other. And we say about more people showing up, the Rov Ha'am Hadrat Melech. When more people show up, that's more of God.
Mm.
So can you use Zoom for vacuous things? Of course. Is that holy? No. But we transform cloth into a tallis.
Right.
We transform metal and plastic and rubber into a key that gets me to my holy community. We transform the raw material into a Torah scroll. Mm-hmm. So how dare I see what has been a godsend as anything less than holy? So halachic concerns, halacha is not a rigid system that doesn't change. That's the basis of conservative Judaism and so much else. But that's also Judaism. Mm-hmm. The sanctification of the things of this world to reach beyond it.
Yeah.
So I think it's exactly the same thing.
I just love the in the essay you wrote, but about the sermon, using kedusha and connecting with holiness. Kedusha and connection, where we think about holiness being separate, but it's also connection with others. That's where we find, I just think about my experience during this last year and a half. And we are coming back in person. We had our first we've been having B'nai Mitzvahs on Shabbat with small groups and streamed, but we had like our regular, I call it the shulis, the people who come to shul. It was an incredible experience, and I want so desperately to be back in person. But the way that we looked at it, and I just give credit to our congregation, our incredible team, that we, not at the expense of anyone's life. And I would rather, I don't look at it as breaking Shabbat, but if there are those who look at it in that way, if I if someone got sick here, I don't know how we could live with ourselves, or I could live with myself. But we're vaccinated and everything. But just going back to this this idea of what it meant to people. I was visiting with one of our congregants who is on the younger side, but was in a nursing home because she had major surgery and couldn't walk for a certain time. And she spoke. I kind of gave it away to people who might be watching, but and I hope she doesn't mind she said this, but she said, I was really against this idea at the beginning of Zoom on Shabbat and why we're doing it. And then this happened, and this pandemic, and I was alone, and being in this hospital bed for 6 weeks, 8 weeks. This was my connection to the outside world. This is my connection to God, and I'm just so grateful. It saved my life, and there were others. And I do look at that as saying, in how we view Jewish law and the humanness of it, and this has really opened my eyes. And I it sounds like it has to you as well. But again, it was this essay that really was challenging for me when I read it, and now I get it. Like now I get it, and I just think it's beautiful. So there's so much more I could talk to you about, but I know you have we all have things to do and everything. So I just want to thank you for this gift, but also the gift of your songs that you've put out into the world. Olam Chesed Yibaneh. I can't tell you how many times we sang it in our congregation, especially after really difficult times. We sang it after Parkland, actually, that first Shabbat. And I just want to thank you for bringing these words, all your words, to the world and to me.
Thank you. My friend David, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share this with me and for reading some of my words, because you really reflect back what I was hoping I would be able to communicate. So until we see each other again and
until we see each other, and we're going to give each other the biggest hugs ever, and hopefully eat some nice kosher Chinese food together.
Amen.
The next time you come to Florida, I'm taking you out. So
I'm in. All right. Take care, my friend.
Be well. I'll talk to you later.
Bye, David.